Hi, and welcome to this episode of John's Motorcycle Rescue and Review. In today's fun classic motorcycle review, we'll be looking at Kawasaki's 1979 through 1989 KZ1300 six-cylinder. This review will focus mainly on the early models of the bike before they went to the fuel injection. The KZ1300 is often compared with Honda's CBX six-cylinder bike, but these two bikes had completely different design parameters. The CBX was definitely designed as more of a sport standard or super bike of the time, and the KZ1300 was really designed to be a big, long-distance touring bike. At the time of its debut in 1979, the KZ1300 was the heaviest, most powerful motorcycle that money could buy. My history with the KZ1300 stretches back to my earliest days of motorcycling. My dad purchased a KZ1300 that had the full touring package from Kawasaki. This is a picture of my dad on the KZ1300. And the next picture here is me sitting on the KZ1300. And I don't know if my dad was crazy or what, but he did let me drive that bike as a 17-year-old. I have a lot of good memories with the KZ1300, including taking the first motorcycle ride that my now wife and I ever took together on this bike, and I was able to ride it quite often while my dad had it. Several years after my dad sold his KZ1300, I purchased a black KZ1300 that was set up a lot like the bike shown in the photos here. It had a GPZ style square fairing on the front of it. My particular bike had a 6-into-1 D&G exhaust on it, and it sounded absolutely amazing. Looking at the specs of the 1300, the first thing we need to talk about is that big, liquid-cooled, inline 6-cylinder motor. The displacement on the motor was 1,286 cc's. It had a 9.9 to 1 compression ratio. The bore and stroke numbers are 62 millimeters by 71 millimeters. So it was an under-square, long stroke design, and it was designed that way to make the 6-cylinder motor narrow. The use of liquid cooling allowed the Kawasaki engineers to also place the cylinders closer to one another than they could if it were an air-cooled motorcycle. This motor is a dual overhead cam design. It has 2 valves per cylinder, and it has shim-type valve adjustment. Power output from the big 6-cylinder was 120 horsepower and 85 foot-pounds of torque at 6,500 RPM. It had an 8,000 RPM redline. We'll just take a quick listen here to what a modified KZ1300 sounds like at the track. Just beautiful. And performance-wise, the KZ1300 clocked off an 11.93 second quarter-mile time at 115 miles an hour in Cycle World testing. It also recorded a 138 mile an hour top speed in testing. The transmission was a slick shifting 5-speed, and it was mated to a right side shaft drive. Gearing on the bike was quite tall compared to other motorcycles of the time, and in top gear at 70 miles an hour, it was revving only 4,000 RPM. That's about 1,000 RPM lower than the Yamaha XS1100, and what that means is, even though this has a bigger motor, even though it puts out more power, the XS1100 was significantly quicker in the 40 to 80 mile an hour roll-on test. The frame on the KZ1300 was a steel tube cradle type frame, and it actually had a cast iron section at the rear that held the rear swing arm, and it was very beefy, very over-engineered, and really designed to deal with the massive output and weight of the motorcycle. Wet weight on the KZ1300 was 709 pounds. That's for the naked version without fairings. Carburation on the KZ1300 was somewhat unique. In an effort to keep the carburetors narrow between the knees, Kawasaki went with 3 2-barrel carburetors. I have pulled these carbs and rejetted them. They were pretty intuitive to figure out, and they function along the same principles as standard style carburetors. The KZ1300 featured a 5.6 gallon fuel tank. It averaged right around 44 miles per gallon in testing, and that gave it right around a 200-mile range, which was pretty decent for bikes of the time. The front forks on the KZ1300 were beefy 41mm forks, and they featured spring internals, and they also had air adjustment on the front forks, and the standard setting was right around 8.8 psi. The front forks also featured a long 7.9-inch travel. The KZ1300 featured conventional dual shocks in the rear, and on some models those were air adjustable for preload. In the braking department, the KZ1300 featured large dual disc brakes up front, and those were acted on by large single piston calipers, and it also had a single disc out back operated on by a single piston caliper. Instrumentation-wise, the KZ1300 housed the gauges in a slick rectangular housing. It featured a large speedometer, a fuel gauge, a temp gauge, and a large tachometer. Ergonomically, the KZ1300 was very roomy. It had a broad seat on it. Styling-wise, the KZ1300 featured the same squared-off styling that Kawasaki was going with in the late 70s. And unfortunately, with the liquid cooling, it really hid the fact that the KZ1300 was a 6-cylinder. And so, whereas on a CBX you had that beautiful 6-cylinder air-cooled motor really out on display, the KZ1300 just did not have the same visual impact as the CBX. What was the KZ1300 like to ride? Well, I distinctly remember my first ride on the KZ1300. My dad actually rode with me, and he was in the passenger seat, so you can imagine how an extremely heavy bike handles with a heavy passenger in the back. Needless to say, I had to learn counter steering very, very quickly. Once the speeds were over 10 miles an hour, however, the bike really smoothed out and the handling was very stable and very predictable, and the smoothness and the quietness of that liquid-cooled 6-cylinder were really unparalleled. With the full fairing and the saddlebags, it was stately in the way that it made power. It never did anything super quickly, but you could hear that big 6-cylinder motor spool up, and it would generate some pretty fast speeds if you stayed in it long enough. Once you got up over 100 miles an hour, the fairing-equipped bike would get a little bit light in the front end, and it would just let you know, hey, back it down, I wasn't really made for this type of riding. On my more standard style KZ1300, it was significantly lighter, and again, above 10 miles an hour, it was a really pleasant place to be. It rode nicely, it actually handled very well for the size of the bike, for the heft of the bike. It was very stable, it was very predictable in the handling, and I found that it worked best in roads that were moderately open. You could go through sweeping corners very quickly. It didn't like the really, really tight corners and bumpy roads, but with a little practice, you could ride it more briskly than you would maybe initially think. Again, the weight of the bike kind of masked the performance that you would think would be on tap with 120 horsepower. The weight also hampered the braking on the bike. It had very good brakes and it stopped well, but it stopped like a 700-pound motorcycle with single piston calipers. The sound from the 6-cylinder motor, especially on mine with the 6-into-1 exhaust, was just glorious. A beautiful sounding motorcycle. So why did I sell my KZ1300? That's a good question, and for me what it came down to was the bike was so tall and so heavy that I was always afraid that I was going to drop it in the garage. I hated backing it in and out of the garage. On my dad's KZ1300, he had actually dropped that bike 3 separate times while sitting in the driveway and looking at something on the bike. Now, why he didn't just put the kickstand down to look at it, I don't know. But once the bike got past a certain point, and it was only a few degrees off of center while you were standing still, there was no stopping it. It was like a sequoia going over, and it would just slowly continue to go over, and you were pretty much powerless. The best that you could hope for was to lay it down slowly on its side. I never dropped mine, I never dropped my dad's, but the weight was just a constant factor that you had to deal with. Shortly after my father got his KZ1300, we were riding together, and he was not used to a bike that had the full fairing. And so when you sat behind the full fairing, it was somewhat deceptive because it hid the sense of speed. And I remember him coming into a very sharp left-hand downhill corner at a much higher speed than he had anticipated. And as he bent the bike into the corner, it started to gouge a groove in the pavement with the center stand. And so ultimately, miraculously, he was able to keep the bike from falling over. I don't know how. He ended up riding out the rest of the corner in the ditch beside the road and managed to get the bike back up on the road. But I think had he been on a bike that weighed less than the KZ1300, he would have levered the rear wheel right off of the pavement and wiped out at that spot. And I think the weight just saved him. It was quite a scary experience and quite the shower of sparks going around that corner. In the end, I think the KZ1300 is just a big, burly motorcycle. It's very well suited to long-distance touring, where the smoothness of the six-cylinder engine can be enjoyed. I like the uniqueness of the inline six-cylinder motor, and there really haven't been that many inline six-cylinder motorcycles throughout motorcycling history. It was certainly a roomy motorcycle, and I enjoyed the roominess of it. One of the only real complaints with the bike was that the fuel tank was quite wide in the back in order to give it a decent touring range. And so you always felt a little bit sprawled out between the knees. Later models of the KZ1300 featured fuel injection. They also featured a more comprehensive fairing in the front and an even heavier design on the bike. The later ones also got a larger stator, and that was more applicable to a touring setup where riders might be running extra lights or heated vests. And on my KZ1300, the stator died, and I had to replace it, and I went with the larger, later model stator. And thankfully, it was just a bolt-up option, and I was able to put that on, and everything functioned as it should afterwards. It's interesting to me that Kawasaki also released the KZ1000 shaft in 1979. I currently have a nice example of one of those in the garage. And if you compare the performance numbers between those two bikes is actually very similar, and that's simply due to the much lower weight on the KZ1000 shaft. Well, I'd love to know what you guys think. If there are any KZ1300 fans out there or KZ1300 owners, please let me know in the comment section below. As always, I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and until next time, enjoy the ride.